The iron taste was overwhelming, thick and hot, coating the floorboards like crude oil, a fresh, sickly sweetness layered over the perpetual stench of lye, sweat, and old decay that clung to the damp walls of the cellar. The silence, heavy and unnatural, was the loudest thing in the room. It was the silence not of a lack of sound, but of a refusal of it. A deliberate, agonizing absence that stretched the nerves of the man who commanded the space. Silas Thorne, the jailer, stood hunched, his massive, calloused hand still twitching slightly, the surgical shears, less surgical than brutally sharpened metal, clutched loosely in his grip. The light from the sputtering tallow candle, held high in the other hand, cast long, dancing shadows that made the cramped, dirt-floored enclosure seem vast and terrifyingly lonely. He looked down at the last captive, Elias, whose body was draped limply over a splintered wooden stool, his chest heaving shallowly, a dark, pulsing geyser where his voice should have been. Elias was the final piece. 4 others had already yielded their breath to Thorne's exquisite patience and terrible tools, yet none had yielded the crucial location. 4 sacrifices, each death confirming the other's resolve, hardening Elias's silence into an impenetrable shield. But Elias was different. He was the one who knew the secret route, the keeper of the memory, the man whose quiet intellect had orchestrated the disastrous attempt at liberation that had led them all here. Thorne had waited 3 days for Elias, savoring the anticipation, systematically dismantling the others first. He believed that the isolation, the sheer weight of being the final repository of hope and knowledge, would break him. He had been wrong. Now, as the crimson liquid pooled rapidly around Elias's feet, soaking into the unforgiving earth, Thorne felt a dizzying mixture of triumph and catastrophic failure. He had secured the silence he craved, the final, absolute guarantee that no word, no whispered plea, no coded syllable could pass the captive's lips. But the critical information, the location of the remaining 37 escapees who had slipped into the tangled, unforgiving maze of the Great Cypress Swamp, remained locked behind Elias's vacant eyes. The context of this horror was the American frontier, a landscape of raw brutality in the early 19th century, where human lives were measured in bales of cotton and hours of forced labor. This cellar was a forgotten corner of a sprawling estate in the remote reaches of Georgia, a place where the sun rarely reached and where overseers like Thorne operated with impunity, their actions sanctioned by the very earth beneath their feet. The air was thick with the promise of more heat and the inescapable reality of the grave. The conflict was raw and essential, survival versus information. Thorne needed the intelligence before dawn. The head planter, a man whose temper was legendary and whose financial ruin loomed if the workforce was lost, was returning. Thorne knew that if he failed to produce the route map or the cache of weapons before morning, his own life would be forfeit, and his death would be far less merciful than the ones he had just administered. He kicked the stool away, letting Elias slump to the ground with a sickening, wet thud. Elias didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, only the rattle of air being drawn through his mutilated throat providing any evidence that he was still anchored to the world. His eyes, though dull with shock and pain, held a terrifying composure, a profound and absolute victory in the face of annihilation. Thorne knelt, his breath ragged. He looked closely at the man he had just silenced forever. The act had been gruesome, even by his standards. He had started with the standard tools of coercion, lash, heated iron, and the deliberate deprivation of water, but Elias had endured it all with a stoicism that bordered on the divine. It was only when Thorne had begun detailing the promised future of Amara, the woman Elias loved, detailing the special sail and the long, brutal march west she would face, that Elias had finally shown a flicker of pain, a momentary break in his fortress of self-control. Thorne, recognizing the vulnerability, had pressed the advantage, demanding the location, the river fork, the rendezvous point where the escapees would meet their guides to freedom, the promised land they called Canaan. But Elias had simply closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, preparing a final defiant utterance, and that was when Thorn had chosen the shears. It was not intended merely to inflict pain, but to remove the instrument of defiance itself. The snap of the metal, the slippery resistance of muscle and tissue, and the subsequent gush had been sickeningly final. But in his vicious haste, in his absolute confidence that the source of the secret must be eradicated before it could be shared, Thorn had committed a fatal error of psychological assessment. He had mistaken communication for mere sound. "You win the quiet, nigger," Thorn hissed, the words tight and venomous, echoing slightly in the small space. "You win the everlasting quiet, but those others, they die because of your silence. And your woman, she'll think of you every mile west, rotting in this pit, knowing her fate was sealed because you couldn't speak one damned word." Elias lay there, listening, but not hearing. His world was receding, becoming a tunnel of throbbing, fiery agony. Yet a strange, cold clarity had begun to bloom in the dark recess of his mind. The pain was immense, an anchor dragging him down, but the secret remained afloat, unsunk. He had paid the ultimate price to keep it, and he would not let the sacrifice be in vain. He felt the wetness spreading beneath his chin, a torrent that would soon bleed him dry. He needed to act, and he needed to act now, before the trauma shut down his consciousness completely. The secret had to leave him, had to be transmitted, even if his means of doing so were horrific, grotesque, and wholly unprecedented. The open loop spun wildly around Thorn. The location of the escapees, the existence of the planned route to the north, the so-called underground current, and the fact that Elias had hidden not just information, but the very tools necessary for a larger uprising. Thorn stood up, wiping the slick residue of Elias's life onto his rough, stained breeches. He was frustrated, breathing heavily, pacing the confined space like a trapped animal. He considered burning the body immediately, tossing it into the slave graveyard without ceremony, yet his anxiety was a physical weight. The master was returning. He needed something to show for his 3 days of calculated cruelty. "It's not finished, old man," Thorn muttered, kicking a stray piece of rope near Elias's outstretched arm. "I'll find them anyway. I'll take pieces of you with me until I do." Elias, utilizing a last Herculean effort of will, focused on the immediate surroundings. His body was sinking into the blood-soaked soil. He needed a writing surface, and he needed an instrument. The floor was rough-hewn dirt, uneven and impossible for detail. His eyes scanned the stone wall, the rough wood of the door, and then settled on the single smooth floorboard near his knee, likely dislodged during the struggle. His right hand, stiff from 3 days of shackles, was still marginally functional. He maneuvered it slowly, painfully, into the viscous pool of his own leaking life fluid. The texture was warm and thick, clinging to his skin like heavy mud. He dragged the hand along the ground, seeking purchase, something sharp, anything that could scratch or score the wood. Thorn, distracted by his own furious pacing, hadn't noticed the subtle shift in Elias's posture. He was too consumed by the rage of his failed extraction, the sheer audacity of this man who had died without speaking. Thorn's triumph in silencing Elias was now curdling into a bitter, dangerous realization of his impending failure to the master. The escalation had reached a point of no return. Elias was dead to the world, a martyr to his cause, but the information was still alive. This pattern interrupt, the removal of the tongue, had not solved the conflict. It had merely shifted the battlefield. As Thorn turned his back, preparing to retrieve a bucket of water to clean the worst of the mess before disposing of the corpse, Elias found what he was looking for: a small, sharp sliver of flint, likely used to start the candle fire earlier, nestled between the damp earth and the floorboard. He closed his fingers around it, the sharp edge digging deep into his palm, a fresh wave of agony mingling with the dull, pervasive ache of his throat. He drew his hand back, now slick with blood from both his mouth and his palm. He lifted his head slightly, a small wet sound escaping the wound, a sound that was not a word, but a desperate, agonizing effort to orient himself. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline, Elias leaned his weight onto his elbow and dragged his saturated hand across the smooth, dusty floorboard. The contact was messy, shaky, but deliberate. The blood, rich with oxygen and still flowing fiercely, provided an immediate dark, shocking pigment against the pale wood. Elias pressed the flint shard firmly into the wood and began to score the material, etching a deep line, using his entire body weight for leverage. Thorn heard a faint scratching sound, an unnatural disturbance in the silence he had purchased so dearly. He froze mid-step, his nerves instantly taut. It was a faint, scraping noise, like a rat trying to burrow through the floor. He dismissed it at first. The cellar was full of vermin, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too focused. He spun around quickly, the candle flame flaring wildly, throwing erratic light onto the tableau. What he saw was not the inert corpse of a defeated man, but a terrifying, spectral determination. Elias was sprawled, half submerged in his own effluent, his torso twisting at an impossible angle. His right arm was moving in a slow, sweeping motion, dragging the gory pigment across the pale wood, meticulously forming shapes. The critical realization hit Thorn with the force of a blacksmith's hammer. Elias could not speak, but he could write. He had silenced the voice, but he had failed to silence the mind. And the medium Elias had chosen was the ultimate defiance. His own lifeblood, the substance Thorn had carelessly allowed to spill onto the floor. "No!" Thorn roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated panic and fury. He stumbled forward, dropping the candle, which immediately flickered out, plunging the cellar into absolute, choking darkness. The only light now came from the thin shaft of moonlight struggling through a high, barred window, illuminating the scene in ghastly, silver-grey tones. Elias worked faster, the darkness momentarily shielding his final actions. He was etching a simple, yet utterly vital shape onto the wood, a symbol he knew Thorn would instantly recognize. A cross, an arrow, a specific configuration of lines that represented the confluence of two creeks, the key to the river fork. He smeared the blood, obscuring the detail, but then using the sharp flint he deepened the etching, ensuring the lines were carved into the wood itself, impervious to blurring. Thorn crashed into him, his heavy boot connecting with Elias's side, eliciting a silent internal scream of renewed agony, but Elias did not stop. He completed the final jagged line that confirmed the exact point of the rendezvous. The massive weight of the jailer pressed down on him, and Thorn's hands found Elias's neck, squeezing, intending to finally snuff out the stubborn life. But Thorn's focus was not purely on murder. It was on the horrifying, bloody message spread across the floorboard just inches away. As his vision faded to black, Elias felt the terrible, satisfying payoff. The mission was complete. The secret was out. He had traded his voice for their freedom, and that trade, soaked in his own gore, was final. Thorn pulled back, gasping, the adrenaline making his heart pound violently. He fumbled for the candle, finally locating it and lighting the wick with a trembling hand. The flickering light revealed Elias's body, now truly slack, finally defeated, the stream of blood slowing to a sluggish drip. But the light also illuminated the floorboard. The message, crude, crimson and terrifyingly clear, was indelibly marked onto the wood. It was a map, not of roads or trails, but of the specific critical confluence of the two tributaries deep within the swamp. The river fork. Thorn stared, his face contorted in a mask of realization and utter, soul-shaking failure. He had cut out the tongue to enforce silence, and in doing so, he had provided the very ink necessary for the hostage's final damning communication. The silence had not kept the secret, it had merely transformed the method of its delivery, turning Elias's martyrdom into a critical piece of operational intelligence. The map was drawn in his blood. The survival of the remaining escapees hinged now on how quickly Thorn could decipher the precise detail in that gory drawing, and how much time Elias had bought them with his sacrifice. The journey had ended for Elias, but for the others, guided by the memory of this defiance, the true flight for Canaan was just beginning. The jailer had the secret, but the cost was more than he could bear, and the horror had only just commenced. The stage is set, the map is drawn, the blood is drying. The jailer must now act on the horrifying, viscous intelligence, but the true terror awaits him in the swamp, where the survivors lie in wait, guided by the knowledge purchased with a tongue and written in life. The world had dissolved into a ringing silence, punctuated only by the wet, rhythmic sound of Silas choking on his own ruin. Keeper Thorn, a figure molded from thick muscle and the cheap leather of his jacket, stood over him, his face slicked with sweat and a fine mist of arterial spray. The blade, freshly cleaned on a strip of sacking, was tucked back into his belt, the deed done with a terrible surgical finality that had silenced the last vestige of resistance. The iron scent of the dungeon intensified, not merely the damp earth and stagnant sewage that usually clung to the stones, but a sharp coppery cloud that seemed to suffocate the air itself. Silas lay sprawled, his body shaking with involuntary spasms that were not quite convulsions, but the body's frantic attempt to mourn the missing piece of flesh, the organ of identity and communication, violently excised. Blood poured thick and dark, pooling immediately on the cold, unforgiving floor of the cell. It was a deluge, a gruesome outpouring that soaked his worn cotton shirt and plastered itself to the rough stubble of his chin. Thorn grinned, a triumphant, awful expression that stretched the hard lines around his eyes. He had achieved the ultimate mastery. He had neutralized the vessel without destroying the memory it contained, yet he had guaranteed the complete failure of communication. "See, dog?" Thorn's voice was low, resonant, dripping with satisfied cruelty. "You have the secret still. It's rattling around in that thick skull of yours, useless now, just yours. You chose silence and I guaranteed it. Now tell me, what good is your defiance when you cannot even beg?" Silas tried to move, tried to gasp, but the attempt produced only a high-pitched gargling sound, a wet, horrifying rattle that vibrated in his ruined throat. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, were fixed on Thorn, burning not with terror but with a desperate, crushing urgency that transcended physical pain. The clock in his mind, the hidden clock counting down to the planned insurrection, was ticking faster than the sluggish drips of water from the ceiling. They were running out of time. The others, the ones waiting in the deep woods beyond the plantation boundaries, would move precisely at the appointed hour, and if they moved into the trap Thorn had unwittingly set, it would mean annihilation. Silas forced a trembling hand up, dragging his fingers across his mangled mouth, gathering the hot, viscous fluid. He pointed wildly toward the wall, then toward Thorn, then back to his throat. He clawed at the air, trying to mime the concept of writing, of telling, of warning. But his coordination was broken, his movements too frantic and pain-ridden to cohere into any meaningful gesture. Thorn chuckled, a dry, grating sound. He mistook the frantic movements for the final throes of delirium, the animal lashing out against its fatal wound. "Oh, you want to pray now, to the good Lord who gave you that soft, lying tongue. He won't hear you, slave, not down here in the dark." Thorn kicked a loose stone casually, sending it skittering across the floor, narrowly missing Silas's head. "I have your secret, and you have nothing but this slick floor to keep you company." But Silas was not praying. He was calculating. The pain was a fire, an absolute consuming blaze that threatened to pull him down into the blackness of shock. Yet the mission, the horrifying knowledge of the trap waiting for the escapees, acted as a searing counterforce, an internal imperative that overruled all biological protest. He could not speak the names. He could not describe the deployment of the patrols. He could not warn them about the hidden sharpshooters near the old sycamore root. but he still possessed the means to communicate. He only needed a surface and ink, and a profound disregard for the continued integrity of his own body. He forced himself to shift, dragging his torso across the rough, cold flagstones until he reached a patch of relatively clean earth where the stone floor met the damp subterranean wall. He tasted the grit and fear, the mixture of earth and copper overwhelming him. The blood was running thick and fast, a constant, unrelenting fountain. He lowered his head intentionally, letting the raw wound drain freely onto the stone. He waited, his mind sharp despite the agonizing throbbing, until a generous pool, dark, shining, and utterly vital, had collected. It was the only ink he had, drawn at the highest possible cost. Thorn watched, amused as Silas seemed to be drinking the floor, or maybe just attempting to rest his battered head. The keeper adjusted his posture, leaning against the cold stone doorframe, settling in for the slow, satisfying death rattle. "Rest, Silas. The effort is pointless now," Thorn advised mockingly. Then Silas moved. It was not a large movement, but it was deliberate, possessed of a terrible clarity. He lifted his hand again, saturated now not just with the initial gore, but dipping it deep into the puddle on the floor. The warmth was repulsive, yet familiar. He braced himself on one elbow, ignoring the waves of dizziness that threatened to pull him under, and began to write. He didn't use an actual writing implement. His finger, thick and trembling, had to suffice as the crude stylus. He dragged it across the flat stone, pushing the viscous liquid until it stained the grey surface a horrifying, deep maroon. The first mark was shaky, almost illegible, but fueled by adrenaline and the sheer magnitude of the secret he carried, the subsequent marks gained definition. He was not writing letters, not at first. Letters were too slow, too prone to misinterpretation in the dim light of the single sputtering lantern. He was drawing a symbol known only to the escapees, a crude, stylized rendering of a segmented route, which in their hidden lexicon meant, "The trap is sprung here." Thorn stopped chuckling. He straightened slowly, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. This was not the random movement of a dying man. This was focus. This was work. "What in the hell are you doing, boy?" Thorn demanded, his voice suddenly stripped of its easy cruelty, laced instead with suspicion. Silas did not stop. He was operating purely on instinct now, his body numb save for the relentless pounding of his heart and the slick, awful sensation of his own blood coating his fingers. He finished the symbol and then, knowing he had little time, started on the crucial details. The blood flowed quickly, drying fast on the stone, forcing Silas to repeatedly press his hand back to his mouth, recoating his fingers in the vital fluid, maximizing the flow, ensuring his message would be visible, undeniable. Each time he pulled his hand away from his mouth, he was met with a fresh eruption of pain and a renewed rush of copper taste, but he pushed through it, prioritizing the message over his own fading life. He wrote 3 stark, heavy words beneath the symbol. The letters were large, disproportionate, etched into the stone with desperate force. Sycamore. 5. Tunnel. Thorn watched the agonizing, slow reveal. He took a single, heavy step forward, his breath catching in his chest. At first, the pattern looked like mere smudges of filth, the death twitch of an animal playing in its own offal. But the words, rendered in the most appalling ink imaginable, took shape under the flickering lantern light. The realization struck Thorn not as a slow understanding, but as a physical blow to the stomach. He had intended to silence the man, yet Silas, in his final desperate act, had weaponized his own death. He had sacrificed the integrity of his remaining body to create a voice more terrifying and permanent than any words spoken. Thorn dropped to his knees, not in reverence but in shock, staring at the message. The keeper was a man of visceral cruelty, accustomed to pain and death, but this act, this absolute final self-mutilation to facilitate communication, transcended mere suffering. It was a holy horror. He read the words again, tracing the blood-slicked characters with his eyes. Sycamore. That was the boundary marker, the point of rendezvous where the scouts were supposed to meet the main party. 5. That was the time. Not the hour, but the number of men waiting, or perhaps the number of minutes remaining before the advance. Given the sheer panic the message instilled, Thorn instantly assumed the latter. 5 minutes. Tunnel! The revelation that sent a cold spike of fear directly through Thorn's hardened heart. The escape plan was not an overland panicked flight. It involved the forgotten sealed drainage tunnel beneath the old distillery house, a route Thorn had always dismissed as flooded and impassable. The tunnel led directly into the unprotected servants' quarters on the main property. If they used the tunnel, they wouldn't be running away from the plantation, they would be infiltrating it. The secret was not a plan for escape, but a plan for silent, bloody invasion. Silas, having delivered his message, slumped backward, his strength finally failing. The heavy, metallic smell of the blood was now overwhelming. His job was done. He had given them the where and the when, and more importantly, the how. The forgotten tunnel that negated all of Thorn's carefully placed external defenses. Thorn rose, his uniform stained where he had knelt, his eyes wide and panicked, stripping away the mask of the smug torturer and revealing the frightened man underneath. The secret was out, purchased not with promises or bargaining, but with the very life essence of the prisoner. "Guard! Guard!" Thorn bellowed, scrambling toward the cell door, his usual measured calm shattered. The metallic rattle of the keys in his hands seemed deafening in the sudden storm of his fear. "Sound the alarm! Now, the tunnel! Get men to the old distillery house. Arm yourselves. They are coming in, not going out." He threw the door open, stumbling into the narrow corridor, shouting for the sluggish, half-sleeping night watch. The alarm bell, usually reserved for fire or invasion by external forces, began to clang immediately, a ragged, uneven sound that spread panic throughout the sleeping compound. The air in the cellar, moments ago heavy with the intimacy of torture, was now charged with the raw electricity of impending conflict. Silas lay in the center of his cell, surrounded by his own horrifying canvas. He could hear the shouts above, the pounding of heavy boots, the terrified neighing of horses being startled from their stables. The pain was still immense, a burning absence where his voice had been, but a flicker of cold, fierce satisfaction crossed his face. He had lost his tongue, but found his ultimate voice. The message, written in the stark, accusing red, was indelible evidence of his sacrifice and Thorn's failure. The Keeper had assumed that physical mutilation was the end of communication. He had gravely underestimated the sheer, terrifying desperation of a man fighting for the survival of his people. Silas closed his eyes. The final image burned into his retina, being the sight of Thorn's petrified face, realizing that the silence he had imposed had only led to a far louder, bloodier declaration. The plantation was awake, but it was awake to panic, not preparedness. The knowledge was out, and the gears of the insurrection, driven by Silas's final bloody transcription, had begun to grind inexorably toward their conclusion. But the question remained, had he been fast enough? Had he revealed the secret with enough time remaining to mobilize the guards, thereby saving Thorn's life? Or had he only ensured that the guards would meet their fate precisely where the enslaved knew they would be waiting? The battle was now joined, a bloody confluence of betrayal and desperate survival, fueled by the iron and copper spilled on the floor of that dark subterranean cell. The full weight of the consequence, the success or failure of the entire brutal endeavor, had yet to be tallied. The next moments would determine if Silas had merely sacrificed his life, or if he had, in fact, saved an entire generation of freedom fighters. The silence of the cell was now a roar, the final frantic minutes counting down to the midnight ambush that Silas's bloody oracle had foretold. They were moving now. They were already moving. The tunnel was their path, and the sycamore was their grave, or their genesis. To witness the brutal final confrontation and the fate of the enslaved people, and the murderous jailer, continue to part 3. The humid air in the subterranean confinement, thick with the stench of unwashed fear and spent effort, suddenly chilled as Master Silas registered the geometry of the slick, copper-colored message staining the stone floor. It was no mere puddle, no spasm of a dying man's fear. It was a deliberate drawn schema, ugly and profound, written in the only ink Elias had left. Silas's breath hitched, a dry, sharp intake that scraped his throat raw, mimicking the jagged edges of the stump where Elias's tongue had been moments before. The symbols, initially dismissed as the death throes of a brain addled by pain, now coalesced into dreadful clarity. This was not a lament, it was a map. The central smear, wide and pooling, represented the deep foundation of the great house, specifically the overlooked and seldom used earthen cellar beneath the pantry wing, the very spot that had been deemed inaccessible due to its chronic dampness and proximity to the dog kennels. Radiating from this pool were 3 distinct lines. 2 were long, sweeping curves denoting the paths of the perimeter guards, easily discernible by anyone who had been forced to watch their monotony. And the 3rd, short and piercingly direct, pointed towards the river swamp line, a treacherous route known only to those born and raised on the bayou's edge. But the most damning element, the detail that plunged an icy dagger directly into Silas's chest, was the temporal marker. Near the base of the foundation pool, Elias had drawn a crude, segmented circle, divided into 4 quadrants, and a single thick line of clotted red had been drawn to mark the 3rd segment, the 3rd bell. The precise, narrow window between the first waking light and the full muster of the plantation hands and the changing of the guard dogs. The moment of greatest vulnerability. Silas finally understood the terrifying genius of the man he had silenced. Elias had not simply refused to break, he had used his torture as the very canvas for his final critical communique. He had traded his voice for the absolute guarantee that the precise timing and location of the uprising would be known, sacrificing his present pain for their future freedom. The horror of the betrayal was paralyzing, a shock that transcended the simple anger of a master defied. It was the recognition of a terrifying, silent intellect that had worked under the very nose of his interrogation, thriving in the dark, leveraging the assumption of inferiority until the last bloody drop. Elias lay still now, his breathing shallow, wet sounds escaping the gap in his teeth, his eyes wide and vacant, staring up at the low ceiling, but Silas knew the victory was already sealed on the floor beneath his boots. The secret was out, and the timing was imminent. A cold sweat plastered Silas's shirt to his back. How long until the 3rd bell? An hour, perhaps less. He had wasted precious time in the gruesome theater of extracting the tongue, believing he had achieved total dominion, when in fact he had merely provided the crucial supply of ink. He spun, his heavy boots skidding slightly on the bloody grit, rushing toward the heavy oak door. He had to reach the overseer, had to scream the alarm, had to mobilize the hounds and the field hands, but the paralyzing fear of being too late weighed down his limbs like chains. He glanced back at Elias, the victim who was now the executioner of Silas's peaceful sleep and stable fortune. Elias's lips barely moved, but a small, dark red bubble burst on the corner of his mouth, and Silas swore he saw a flicker, a fleeting spark of triumph, cold and ancient in the captive's eyes. Silas burst from the cell block into the relative gloom of the morning stable yard. The air outside was thick with the scent of dew and manure, but beneath it, the master perceived a subtle, unnatural quiet. The usual cacophony of the pre-dawn bustle was muted. The chickens were silent, the dogs were quiet, chained still in their rotated kennels, awaiting the relief shift. The stillness was the sound of preparation, the breathless hush before a storm breaks. He ran, clumsy and heavy, toward the main house, his heart pounding a frantic counterpoint to the impending disaster. His mind raced over the implications. The entire structure of his authority, the generations of inherited wealth built upon the bones of these silent men and women, was about to be jeopardized by one man's final desperate message. As he reached the back porch steps, the sound came. Not the distant, mournful cry of an alarmed slave, but the deep, resounding toll of the massive iron bell, usually reserved for fire or extreme emergency. The first toll was heavy, a promise of weight. Silas stumbled up the steps, grasping the brass railing for balance. Too soon, he thought desperately, it cannot be time, but the cook must have been ordered to strike the bell early, signaling the start of the chaotic shift, providing the necessary cover noise. Ding! The second toll vibrated through the floorboards, shaking Silas to his core. He didn't waste time running to his study to retrieve his pistol. He knew exactly where he had to go. Following the line Elias had drawn in blood, Silas pounded toward the pantry wing, his eyes wide, straining to pierce the deep shadows clinging to the eastern foundations. The bell had only one more strike. Ding! The third toll. The signal. The moment the sound died, swallowed by the morning humidity, the ground beneath Silas's feet seemed to shudder, not from the bell, but from movement, mass, and force applied from below. He reached the narrow wooden cellar door, usually bolted from the outside, only to find the heavy bar resting haphazardly against the frame. Someone, likely Caleb, Elias's cousin and the strongest man on the compound, had slipped out during the chaos of the second bell. Silas lunged for the handle, yanking the door open. A rush of cold, earthy air, thick with the smell of mold and stored root vegetables, hit him. He saw movement instantly. A mass of dark figures, crouched low, rising like specters from the earth, their faces grim shadows, illuminated only by the faint pre-dawn light filtering down the narrow opening. They were armed crudely, hoes, shovels, sharpened spikes fashioned from broken tools. "Stop!" Silas roared, his voice cracking with panic and adrenaline. The figures froze for a split second, surprised by his sudden, solo appearance. They had counted on the third bell, giving them a full 5 minutes of undetected movement. Caleb, broad-shouldered and fierce, was the first to react. He held a hefty iron fireplace poker, its tip crudely honed. Caleb didn't speak. There was no need for words. Elias's silence had purchased Caleb's action. The first conflict of the escape was brutal and localized. Silas, though panicked, was massive and fueled by the primal rage of ownership threatened. He slammed the cellar door frame with his body, trying to block the exit, but the momentum of the emerging escapees was too great. Caleb lunged, swinging the poker with a force born of years of pent-up oppression. Silas ducked, the iron rod whistling past his ear, and he grabbed the closest neck he could find, a younger woman named Tamsin, using her body as a temporary shield. "I will shoot you all!" Silas screamed, though he was unarmed. The lie was useless. They knew he was alone. The cramped space was chaos. The figures pouring out of the cellar were focused, silent, and deadly serious. They knew they had to be fast. The sound of the escape would soon wake the rest of the plantation, and the dogs would be released. Caleb struck again, this time aiming lower. The poker connected with Silas's knee, a sickening, dull thwack that sent a blinding bolt of pain up his leg. Silas roared, releasing Tamsin, who scrambled free and sprinted toward the cover of the nearby cotton field rows. Disabled by the blow, Silas pitched forward, tumbling into the earth opening. He fell hard, landing on sacks of potatoes and bruising his ribs on the cold, damp stone steps. Above him, the escape continued, a torrent of desperate bodies scrambling out. Caleb stood over the opening, his face a mask of resolute fury, not hatred, but necessity. "Go!" Caleb commanded in a low, guttural whisper to the remaining few. "Follow the swamp line! Go!" Silas, struggling to pull his weight up the steps, clawed at Caleb's boots. "You fool! You cannot survive out there. I will find you. I will hunt every last one." Caleb didn't listen to the empty threat. He reached down, grabbed Silas's flailing arm, and used the momentum of Silas's own desperate scrabble to pull him fully out of the opening, not to save him, but to clear the path. Silas landed heavily on the soil, momentarily stunned. The scene around him was dissolving into the creeping dawn. 20 or more dark shapes were already breaking free, scattering into the shadows, running low through the tall grasses toward the dense protective embrace of the bayou. Caleb was the last. He paused only long enough to look back toward the distant low building of the jailhouse. The sacrifice had been made. The path was clear. Silas, desperate and blinded by blood loss from a scrape across his cheek, lunged wildly, trying to grab Caleb's ankle. He caught only air. Caleb turned, meeting the master's gaze one last time. He raised the poker, not in a wild attack, but in a final cold execution. The heavy iron descended with precision onto the back of Silas's head, just above the hairline. There was no sound from Silas, only a wet, sickening crunch that felt wrong, unnatural. His massive body went instantly slack, his eyes rolling back to show only the whites, and he slumped onto the wet ground. The master, who had silenced his captive, was now silenced himself, lying in the dirt exactly where Elias's bloody map had indicated the foundation lay, his blood mixing with the already drying message. The sound of the struggle, though muffled, finally alerted the nearest field hand quarters. A single shrill scream pierced the morning air, followed by the frenzied barking of the rotation dogs being hastily released from their kennels. The alarm had been raised, but it was too late. The brief, critical window purchased by Elias's ultimate sacrifice had closed. Caleb did not stay to watch the chaos unfold. He tossed the poker, a weapon of temporary necessity, into the nearest bush and ran. He moved with the desperate, focused energy of a man whose life was no longer entirely his own, but belonged to the secret, silent community he was joining. He ran toward the swampline, recognizing the path drawn in the blood of his kin, the final direction marker of a message written on the floor of a cell that no one would dare enter for hours. The morning light fully broke over the plantation minutes later, illuminating a scene of utter devastation. The jailhouse was eerily silent, the door slightly ajar. Inside, Elias lay cold, his eyes still open, reflecting the pale light, his mutilated mouth forever unable to speak, yet his purpose forever enshrined in the gruesome tableau on the floor. His blood had clotted, turning the urgent red of the map into a dark, indelible stain, a permanent record of the precise moment of victory. Master Silas was found sprawled near the cellar entrance, dead, a silent testament to the efficacy of the rebellion. His death was secondary to the greater loss, the disappearance of over 20 men, women and children who vanished into the dense undergrowth, taking with them not only their physical selves, but years of Silas's invested wealth and security. The pursuit was immediate, desperate, and ultimately futile. The plantation guards, following the conventional routes and trails, found nothing. The escapees had vanished into the terrain only they truly knew, guided by the very specific, treacherous route, the swamp line, that Elias had indicated. The critical secret, revealed by the mute man's blood, was not just the location, but the confirmation that the community was united, their intelligence gathering superior, and their will absolute. Elias's body was later removed, taken away by the remaining hands, who moved with a newly instilled, terrifying reverence. Though he died voiceless and mutilated, he had achieved the most powerful utterance of his life, the silent decree of freedom. The master had sought to deny him language, but had inadvertently forced him to communicate in a universal script legible by necessity, a dialect of survival and defiance written in the costliest of inks. The jailer had cut out the tongue, hoping to bury the truth in silence. But in doing so, he allowed the secret to rise, sharp and undeniable, painted in scarlet, ensuring that the ground on which they stood would forever bear witness to the price of liberty and the silent, terrifying power of the utterly oppressed. The story of that night, whispered in hushed tones around cook fires in the years that followed, became a legend not of noise and battle, but of silence and sacrifice, forever reminding those who heard it that the critical secret, sometimes, is best revealed not by sound, but by the deliberate, painful spilling of one's own blood onto the earth that claims them. The memory of the geometry of that bloody map, the stark simplicity of the plan, settled into the deep consciousness of the region, a haunting proof that while power can steal the voice, it can never extinguish the need to communicate the fundamental, undeniable right to be free. The price of that revelation was terrible, but its payoff was the echoing silence of 20 successful departures, a silence more terrifying to the remaining enslavers than any amount of noise could ever be.